So we're very lucky that we actually have people that live in Iowa that do federal policy for a living and that are very good at it. And so yesterday afternoon, I picked up the phone and I said, hey, you might have heard about this blizzard thing. And they figured out pretty quick where it was going and they didn't hang up. And so we also have on the panel today Amanda DeYoung. She's a senior policy advisor with Iowa Corn. She handles their federal portfolio. Now, on the that's a good thing. On the downside, she's a lawyer. But on the upside again, she did spend, before coming to Iowa Corn, had spent quite a bit of time with Senator Chuck Grassley in his D.C. office, working on, among other issues, ag and trade policy, and has also spent some time as a policy advisor to the USDA. And then finally, we have Kevin Kuhle, who is the National Policy Advisor for the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation. And prior to that, he spent some time doing public policy work in the private sector here in Iowa, and I believe also worked on some state, maybe even some national campaigns before getting into that. And they graciously, they don't have a fancy PowerPoint because I sprung this on them yesterday afternoon, but they graciously agreed to come here and to share their views with some of the questions. So I'm going to spend the next several minutes with some questions that we came up with ahead of time. I think there's some of the same questions that you would ask because some of you told me to ask them. And then if I don't know, to get back on track, if we'll take some from the audience, but if we're missing something that you want to know about, think about it, and we'll see if we can get to it. So let's start out with the most obvious. And I've got a wireless thing, so I'll give this to you, and if you guys can share a little bit. So we had this draft RVO, renewable obligation for the Renewable Fuels Standard, come out in late 2013. Here we are at the 2015 summit. It's disappeared into the White House Office of Management and Budget Land Interagency Review. When do you think we're going to see a 2014 RVO come out? And if for that matter, go ahead and speculate on 2015 or 2016. And we'll just kind of, whoever wants to jump in, but we'll try to get all of your perspectives. And I hope you disagree on something. That's what makes these panels fun.
Yeah. So I'm actually not going to make a prediction on when we might see a 14, 15, potentially 16 RVO, because that would actually ruin my chances to win the ongoing pool that exists as to when this rule is actually going to be finalized. So I have to keep my own prediction secret for that reason. But I think that there's no question that it's not coming out tomorrow. And there's no question that a process remains to continue to engage and educate the administration as to what needs to be done to make sure that the statute is intact and this industry is able to continue to thrive the way Congress intended. I think that gets back to my ACT slide, which is going to be a continuing theme. You know, last year was very busy, and it was a full-scale group effort to make sure that we didn't get a bad result in 2014, and I suspect that that will continue this year.
Okay. Amanda?
I would just say I think every single person who placed a bet on this last year was obviously wrong, and you would probably be a lot luckier if you walked next door and placed a bet on one of the tables or on a horse than you would probably betting on when this will actually come out. Obviously, we need this as soon as possible, but as Catherine so eloquently stated, this has given us another really shot or another opportunity to have some input and try to convince the EPA. I think that they have recognized by pulling the rule back that they made a mistake. And that's kind of given us maybe some new life, some new opportunities here to have some influence. So I would say, obviously, we want it sooner than better, but I, like Catherine, am probably not going to be putting a date out there.
I, too, am not going to make any predictions. I'm not going to disagree with any of the ladies up here. One thing that I'll add is that you did see EPA push back the announcement of the rule, and there was such an outcry of support within the countryside, specifically here in Iowa, of comments to the EPA. The governor, Governor Branstad here in Iowa, held a hearing regarding it. Since EPA wouldn't come to us to have a hearing, he held his own hearing here in the state of Iowa. And so you saw an outcry of support not only from our farmers and from our industry leaders, but also from our politicians. not just in Iowa, but also in the Midwest. And so I think that public input, and that grassroots advocacy played a role in EPA's decision not to release those rules, and we're hopeful that we'll continue to influence them before they do announce the rule.
We might keep that close. It's not fair to let these guys have to do all the tough plowing and you come behind, so maybe we'll reverse course. But so at some point in time, let's just say hypothetically, because I would have thought in 2014 that the rule would have been finalized at some point, even if I couldn't predict what month. So let's just, for the sake of this question, say hypothetically we get a 14 rule out. Actually, I don't care about 14. It's gone. It'll impact carryover RINs and all that, so I know it's important, but at the same time, in terms of a market driver, it's done. So we're really looking at if they roll out a 15 and maybe a 16 this year, whenever that might be, what do you guys feel the levels might be? The draft for 14 obviously took a step backwards. Do you think that they'll try to get the RFS back on track, back up to the statutory numbers, somewhere in between? What are your thoughts on where we see them going?
Sure. When we saw that there was speculation that they were going to announce the rules sometime in 14, first it was in the fall, then it turned into the winter, and then it was kicked into this year. But some of the things that we were hearing in D.C. was that they were going to reverse and that they were going to increase the RFS. But I think I need to tailor my remarks that they were increasing from the amount it was already decreased. Their talking points were, oh, we're going to change our minds, we're going to increase it. But it wasn't an increase, it was an increase of the decrease that was proposed. Again, I won't speculate to what the new rule will be. But I know that's what I was hearing in D.C., that they were going to message that they were increasing it. But it was just simply an increase from the amount that it was already decreased, which is an overall decrease to the RVOs.
I think what's going on with gas prices right now is probably going to have an impact. I think if we don't acknowledge that, we're misguided. Depending on what consumers, consumers are putting in their tank, and probably two, the additional mileage that they're driving, is certainly going to, I think is certainly something the EPA is probably looking at right now, and that's probably why we're seeing this further delay. So while I'm not going to speculate what I think the number will be, I think it will be up. But whether they're going to get near the statutory number that we all want to see, I kind of doubt it, to be real.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? So lower gas prices, people drive more, bigger gasoline.
If you look what the differential between E85 is right now and E10, it's not that great depending on where you're at. 25 cents, I think I saw it come and go, or 30 cents I saw it come and go maybe yesterday. So people aren't going to be probably filling up with using as much ethanol, frankly, either, and I think EPA is going to be paying attention to that.
Okay. Catherine?
Sure, and the one thing I would add is that something that I think is critical to keep in mind is this conversation about the RVO. Yes, there's talk about the numbers, but it's really the methodology. That's the most important part of this rule. Because regardless of what the number is, if EPA uses a flawed methodology that isn't consistent with the statute, that undermines the ability to access the market in the long term, that's really not a win. So I think that's something that folks should just keep in mind, is keep an eye on the methodology.
Yeah, for those of you that maybe don't follow this every day like we do, the Renewable Fuels Standard was essentially put in place to crack through the petroleum monopoly and the barriers to competition that the oil companies have put in place over 100 years. And then in the draft rule that came out in 13, the EPA essentially turned the RFS upside down and said, well, if they don't let you in, then we can't raise the number. It's like, wait a minute, you're supposed to raise the number, so they have no choice but to let us in and compete. And so, yeah, we've often said we want them to get the number right. The number is important, but what's even more important is, do they gut the RFS, do they turn it on its head, or do they keep it going? So now that you've teed that up, when they delayed not finalizing the rule last year, some of us decided to take the glass half full approach as opposed to the glass half empty approach and said, well, they obviously could have finalized a bad rule, and they didn't. They punted it off into the next year. So do you think that they're rethinking the methodology? Do you think that that's a sign of that, or do we just have no insight into what's going on at the White House at all?
That's helpful. That's a helpful question. I would say, from my perspective, I think that President Obama and the administration has always been supportive of the biofuel sector. And I think that based on our knowledge of where things stand, our sense is that there's an acknowledgement and an understanding that there was a problem with the proposal as it was put forward. What that means for what the next proposal will be, I think, is an open question. And that is why I think it is so important, for all of you, but also for the members in Congress. We had fantastic support across the board, Republicans and Democrats, for the sector in working with the administration to articulate what some of your concerns were. And I think we're hopeful that we have that same support again, and expect that we will moving forward into the next cycle.
Okay. Amanda, anything? Or
I'll just add maybe that we've got a great champion in Secretary Tom Vilsack, and it appears that he's going to be sticking around until the end of this administration. But it's the last 2 years of the president's term, and you will start to see more and more people starting to leave. Podesta's already left, and I suspect we're going to see more and more of that over the next couple of months, which creates new challenges for us because we've got new people to get to know, people who are going to be in these jobs kind of in a short-term basis, who might not be the number one expert that the president had or could have gotten as an advisor earlier on in his term or in his administration. So I think that's going to be a real challenge. I think the next 2 years, both with EPA and within the White House, is going to be more difficult than the prior years because we're going to have new faces to get to know.
Re-education all over again.
Yeah, and Monte, I'll just like to add, our folks in our congressional delegation have been very supportive of the RFS, and we're opposed to the new rule with the decreased RVOs. And so from what I've heard from their meetings with officials in the White House was kind of a mixed review. Basically, some of the comments that I heard back from our congressional delegation and their staff was that the oil industry has some in the White House concerned that the RIN markets will affect the price of gasoline and gas prices will go through the roof. So the words running scared, I believe, were used when talking about the concerns that they had with the RVOs. And so I think there is a concerted effort by the oil companies to lobby on this issue. Obviously, we all know that. But I think it's very important that we continue to emphasize and stress the importance of the RFS, especially when we talk to, here in Iowa with our presidential candidates visiting this state. It'll be essential, as we've heard about earlier today, to talk to them about the importance of the RFS and how it creates a level marketplace.
I've got a couple more on the administration, but we'll maybe let them off the hook for a while. Let's turn our attention to Congress for a little bit. The House is in Republican control, and now for the first time in several years, the Senate is in Republican control. And I think while it's fair to say that renewable fuels is more of a geographic issue than probably a partisan issue, there's still some statistically speaking, I think some partisan concerns there with Republican control and their view of the proper role for federal policy in energy, whether for oil or for renewables. So will Congress repeal the RFS? Those bills have been introduced. If not, so if you say yes, you got to give a short answer. But if not, do you think that there will be reform efforts? And what do you think might be the most likely type of reform? And trust me, most of the reform efforts on the RFS are just ways of killing it without actually repealing it. But what type of way do you think might actually gain the most? I won't ask you which bill it's on, because as you know, if the Senate really has an open amendment process going forward, it could be anywhere, anytime on any bill. But if they were to actually get one through, what do you think maybe are the thing we have to guard against and really educate the most on is? You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Monte. I'll just speak to talking about that open amendment process. In the Senate, we have ongoing, we had early debates on the Keystone Pipeline. I believe over 50 amendments were filed to that bill specifically, one of which was brought forward by Senator Toomey and Senator Feinstein to basically eliminate the corn ethanol requirements in the RFS. Luckily, that amendment did not reach a vote on the floor, but as Monte mentioned, I think that's going to be a constant threat. We'll have to be constantly vigilant during an open amendment process that they do not offer an amendment on any bill, whether it's energy related or not, to minimize or diminish the RFS.
I think the House will probably vote. The House will vote on something this year. We'll pass. I don't think it really probably matters what they move, whether it's a full repeal or a corn ethanol repeal or something else. In the Senate, it's going to be a little bit different of a story. I think both in the House and Senate, the committees are interested in doing some kind of larger energy bill. I think Keystone is kind of maybe a litmus test to see how much appetite there is to do comprehensive energy reform. It's obviously not going perfectly for Senate Republicans right now, so I think it's going to make the work of the EPW committee more challenging this year. But that being said, I think for sure we will see a vote this year in the Senate on some kind of RFS reform, probably not a full repeal, whether it's a corn ethanol repeal, whether it's some kind of idea that they steal from the House, stock-to-use ratio, or some other thing we've seen, maybe actually making the EPA's 2014 RVO numbers, putting those into statute, codifying what EPA tried to do originally. I think we'll for sure see something in the Senate. I think we'll be able to protect that from passing in the Senate. It's really going to depend on what kind of vote. Frankly, a full repeal vote in the Senate would be probably the best vote we could get, because we could probably defeat that much more easily than some of these other reform tactics, unfortunately. So, my predictions.
Before Catherine jumps in, I'm also the acronym police, because not all of you like to follow the federal government. EPW means Environment and Public Works Committee, and that's the committee in the United States Senate that has jurisdiction over the Renewable Fuels Standard, which of course we call the RFS. So,
sorry.
No, that's fine. It makes me feel like I'm helpful. Go ahead.
Sure. I think those answers really covered mechanics, and so I won't add anything there. I would say, really, the answer to this question is really up to you. And it's up to everyone who has worked on this issue since 2005 and everyone who touches the sector. Not just everyone who owns a plant, not everyone who works at a plant, but the communities that are engaged with the work that you all do every day. The businesses that rely on the work that you do around the country. And I think that it's a constant challenge and we see it every day, to say, well, I've talked to these people for the last 5 years. Do I really need to do it again? And the answer is yes, because they don't remember. And I think that the ultimate answer, maybe not to the question, to both questions. First, is there ever even a vote on this subject? Because that is really the best case scenario. And I think that is still an open question. Is there a vote? And do you win, regardless of what the question is? That is ultimately dependent on the work that you all and everyone in the sector does every day between now and the day that question is posed.
I think I'd add a comment to that too, and it goes off of the fact that you all need to stay engaged, keep going to DC if you have those opportunities, write the letters, send the emails, make the phone calls, because I mentioned earlier that this is an issue which tends to break down geographically just as much or more, quite frankly, than it does on a partisan basis. And that means, the Republican majorities on this are split. And so even if, we might face a pretty tough vote in the House overall, the House leadership has to decide, am I going to bring a vote to the floor that splits my caucus? Last time I checked, they have a hard time keeping that caucus together when they want to. let alone bringing up an issue that they know will split it. And so that's why our supporters, our Iowa delegation, we have people here from 25 states, people in your delegation who are for the RFS, who understand that, tell them to fight the good fight. Even if they say, well, we're probably overwhelmed with the Texas oil guys in the House, that's how it is, go fight it in the Senate. No, fight it in the House. Let the leadership know that you're going to fight this tooth and nail on the floor, because even if they go that far and we lose, it helps us in the Senate. And quite frankly, if they know it's going to be a tough, divisive battle, they may choose not to bring it up. And in the Senate, someone smarter than me, because I can't remember it now, talked about how, so we've got to get a highway bill through the Environment and Public Works, and that's Senator Inhofe who chairs that. He's not a fan of the RFS, but he does have to get a highway bill through. So that pushes you through a lot of this year. Then they start getting into re-election mode, and there's actually quite a few Republican senators up who are pro-RFS. And so are their colleagues going to want to force them into a bad position going into re-election by forcing RFS votes? So that's maybe a couple other things. That doesn't mean, hey, we can sit back, kick the feet up. It means if we keep the pressure on, we do have some leverages out there to defend this thing. And we're talking a little political here. I would also like to remind us that we also have the truth of the fact that it's good public policy. Let us never forget that. Any other comments on Congress, or we might on the RFS of any kind, or I might switch us to tax policy?
I might make one more comment, because we talked a lot about 2016 and the importance of kind of the grassroots politicking, that the candidates, they're going to be coming to people's homes, they're going to be coming to your communities, they're going to be coming to your plants. But remember that our Iowa delegation also has a really unique opportunity here. In fact, Governor Branstad and our 6 elected folks from the state probably have as good of access or better access to all of these candidates than anybody. And they want to hear how they got elected and the things that are important in their district. So I would encourage you not only to talk to those presidential candidates when they're in their community, talk to your congressional representative and the governor. We know he'll do it for sure. But to have them also talk to each candidate that they know or that comes to pay homage to them, and tell them why the RFS is important, because that message needs to not just come from voters. I think it'll be helpful if it comes from our delegation as well.
That's a great point. So tax policy. One of our earlier speakers mentioned that we no longer have a corn ethanol incentive. It's amazing how many East Coast editorial boards don't seem to know that, because it occasionally pops up in their anti-ethanol editorials, something that doesn't exist. And they always, of course, forget to mention the 102 years of continuous industry-specific tax subsidies that go to the oil industry. Although I did see some coverage of the recent Koch brothers event where some potential presidential candidates twisted themselves into pretzels to explain why those weren't tax subsidies. They were just expenditure or something. I don't know. Good luck with that. They are what they are. But because of what the oil industry gets, we have been trying to keep something for the young industries, the biodiesel industry, the cellulosic industry in place. Those have been on again, off again. We just got them extended for 1 year in the middle of December, but retroactively, but then that meant they expired again on December 31st. So isn't it ironic that today oil has taxpayer from you all subsidies and no renewable fuel does? We'd like to get some help back into biodiesel extenders package. Is it going to happen? Is biodiesel cellulose going to be in there? I know with the change in control in the Senate again, maybe to use that theme, there's increased scrutiny on the wind tax credit extension. And if they go after that, does that trickle down? Who wants to start?
Sure, I can. That's perfectly fine.
I'll flip a coin.
Well, we saw that this past year, at the end of the session, they were finally able to pass the tax extender package. There was a negotiated package that would have made some of those provisions permanent, some of them just temporary, continuing to renew them on a 2-year basis, I believe, was the deal that was negotiated. The White House threatened to veto, and that deal fell apart. And so there's a lot of action, a lot of factors in play when we're talking about extending those tax policies. And what I see now with this new congressional majority in the Senate, you see a call for comprehensive tax reform and the idea of lowering the rates overall and eliminating loopholes. Well, a loophole for one person and one group of senators is a vital tax policy for specific industries. For example, President Obama in his State of the Union proposed a tax policy that would eliminate loopholes. He said he wanted to eliminate the stepped-up basis and also increase capital gains tax. Well, all of us in the room know that those two policies are vital for small business owners and for family farms to pass down to the next generation. So a loophole that the president is calling this, some folks are calling it a loophole. For us, it's a vital tax policy that's in place. So I think there's a lot of concerns there when they talk about comprehensive tax reform. Which of those tax extenders are not going to be included in a comprehensive reform? One of the things also to keep in mind is that Congress has a great way of waiting until the last minute to do everything. I wouldn't be surprised if there was another situation where it's at the end of the year and they're forced to pass some type of extension again, as they have over the past years. So that's kind of what I've been hearing in D.C. and some of the things that have been talked about when talking about those tax policies.
I agree with everything Kevin said. Maybe the only thing I would add was I think that as they go through this debate on comprehensive tax reform, whether they actually do anything or not, I'm pretty skeptical that anything will get done and that we will probably end up with a late-term extenders package. Republicans don't want to go into an election year without delivering on some of those things. But I think what it will do this year is really set the platform, really set the stage for what the 2016 candidates are going to be talking about in their platforms. So I think while we might not see comprehensive reform, I think this will kind of set the menu. This will set the stage. I've said it already, I guess, for how the presidential candidates proceed leading up to 2016.
That's a good point about setting the stage, because every day that there's a conversation about tax is the foundation for the following day's conversation about tax. And the only thing I would add on the prospects of comprehensive tax reform during this Congress is, you know, we're talking a lot about 2016 in terms of the presidential race during this panel, but there are an awful lot of senators sitting on the Senate Finance Committee right now who are thinking about 2016 in terms of their own reelection prospects. And that makes it pretty dicey when you're thinking through what comprehensive tax reform, what a successful comprehensive tax reform package actually takes in terms of willingness to compromise for all members and all constituencies. In order for something like that to happen, there is a lot of change that needs to occur. And it's just unclear if the political winds are in place when you take a look at who could be impacted in 2016 for that to happen.
So we'll just do like one-word answers here. You can nod or give me a thumbs up, thumbs down. Will there be a tax? Let's assume for the sake of this question that comprehensive reform does not occur. If it doesn't, will there be a tax extenders package? I'm voting yes. Okay.
Well, I can never answer with just one word.
All right, you get two.
I'm working on it, but I would say, I mean, it's almost impossible to allow these extenders to completely expire in perpetuity by lack of action in the Congress.
So that's a yes.
It's extremely unlikely.
You can see she's worked in the Senate too long. They like to give those long answers. Will biodiesel and cellulosic ethanol fuels be a part? Let's assume that we're right and there is an extenders package. Will biodiesel and cellulosic be extended again?
I believe so.
I think it'd be tough to exclude a few of those extenders, so I think that it would be included. With the hard work of folks, grassroots advocacy, our congressional delegations that care about that issue, making sure that other members join on board and support the extension of those two policies.
If we fight for it. Okay.
Yes.
All right. I'll let you off with a nod
That's
on
a
that
guarantee.
one. So, yeah, and I tend to think so too, and I think it'll probably, unfortunately, be one very similar to what we had last year, which is at the end of the year they'll extend it for 1 year, which, from a biodiesel standpoint, is not exactly all that helpful in terms of how you market your fuel the next year. So, we're going to try to do better. I want to be clear on that. I don't want any of my members to like throw things at me when I come off the stage. But that's probably the realistic output now. But we're going to obviously fight to have a little more certainty going forward. We've got a few minutes left. I'm not an expert, you'd think I would be, but compared to the folks up here on the Farm Bill, in terms of the energy title, is there anything And maybe the answer is, hey, we passed one, it seems to be working, we got all these other big fights. Not that we take our eye off it, but that's not where we have to battle. Are there any battles you see over the next 12 to 24 months on Farm Bill energy title? I know there's other titles, but on the energy title that we need to fight.
I don't. I think we'll likely see amendments that would affect the Farm Bill, but I think it's going to be on other areas: crop insurance, potentially farm management or farm risk management programs. I think one thing to note is USDA just recently announced that the REAP funding is available. They're doing 2 years of funding for 2014 and 2015. It's I think $100 million. Now you might remember in the REAP debate, they got included a provision that would block blender pumps from being eligible for REAP. But the language actually says just retail infrastructure. So I think that there may still be some opportunities for other types of infrastructure to be able to qualify for REAP, but we're going to kind of have to see how that plays out with the USDA. They just released the rule and the announcement of the funding within the last week or two, I think.
I like that. That's the lawyer talking. Retail infrastructure may not actually mean retail infrastructure. Any other thoughts on the Farm Bill?
The only thing I would add, following up on this blender pump amendment, is that in the context of this broader debate on biofuels, I think it should be expected, and it can be difficult to predict exactly what type of attack or opposition you might see. So this is something that is impacting the sector. It's not the Renewable Fuels Standard. You might see other activities like that in sort of this free-for-all amendment scene that I think we're anticipating for some time.
All right, well, I'm going to do one more question, because if I don't do this question, Lucy Norton will kill me. And then we probably actually don't have time, but if someone has a burning question, we will make time. And so if you have a burning question for this panel, go to one of the mics now or forever hold your peace. Or actually, they're going to be around at least for a little bit. You can catch them afterwards. Lucy Norton is in charge of our retailer outreach and marketing programs, and she would tell you that the number one reason by far that we're not seeing more stations offer E15 out is the fact that it's not a year-round fuel because of the difference in volatility requirements. And I know I'm talking a little bit in shop, but the big picture here will come through between E10 and E15. So the oil companies can basically freeze E15 out of many markets during the summer. Is there any way in the next 2 years you see us leveraging the EPA or Congress to equalize the E10 and E15 summertime volatility requirements, because that is our number one problem moving that market forward?
I would say that I think this is increasingly becoming part of the conversation in Washington. It's also incredibly complex for your average observer of this policy space. It's not a 5-minute conversation, and I think that it has taken some time to get to the point where you guys are in terms of the awareness of the importance of this issue. And I would expect that process will need to continue for some period of time. Is there an opportunity? There's always an opportunity, particularly in an environment like the one we've described here. Will it happen? Hard for me to predict that, but I definitely think, at least in the time that I've been working on this topic, that issue is certainly increasingly becoming a part of the conversation.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I'll just add that a lot of education needs to be done on this issue. Like you said, the average person won't necessarily know about it. So I'd say we need to continue to keep the pressure on, and there's always a potential, and I won't speculate as to what may or may not happen there. So.
All right, we have time for one question if we give short answers. Yes, sir.
Hi, Peter Shernian, here in Des Moines, independent reporter. Do the lobbyists that your organizations have talk about the real numbers, financial numbers? When you look at the subsidies that the oil industry gets, as well as their lack of paying taxes. Prime example, $30 billion from Exxon. When our industry pays huge amounts of taxes, the people that it supports provide taxes to this country. It seems like the people in Congress aren't getting the real numbers and seeing the effect of their continued subsidies to the oil industry.
My guess some of those subsidies got a lot more expensive when oil prices dropped from $100 to $50. But any thoughts on that?
We do, yes, we do. I know Monte's group does. I know Catharine does through their work at Fuels America. I know the Farm Bureau does. But we have personally found a lot of times it's the emotional story. You can take a farmer in and he can talk about how this has impacted him personally, how this has impacted his community financially, how it's impacted every sector of related businesses, the banks and the trucking company and everybody else. So we have found that sometimes that's a more powerful message than facts and statistics. And frankly, facts, those numbers are manipulated by our opponents in other ways against us. So it depends on who they want to listen to, unfortunately.
Yeah, with our delegation in Iowa, they're very aware of the benefits that the renewable fuels industry has provided to rural Iowa and to rural America. And luckily, Iowa Farm Bureau is under the umbrella with the American Farm Bureau. And that's 50 states with very different types of agriculture and different interests and needs. But through the American Farm Bureau, we're united in our support for the RFS and the biofuels tax credits that are there. So we continue to make those pushes, and any additional information that we can provide to our delegation is important, but it's also the shift from rural legislators to be more urban areas and fewer people in Washington having a connection to rural America or representing rural parts of the country. It makes it harder and harder to talk and to convince them about the benefits of the renewable fuels industry. So I think we need to continue to tell our story and tell them why it's good not only for rural America, but for our country in general.
And one thing I would add to that end, a great resource that Fuels America put out last year is actually an economic study that takes a look at that exact point and evaluates the ripple effect of the Renewable Fuels Standard and the biofuel sector throughout the country, not just in those congressional districts where there's a direct financial interest or a plant producing fuel, but instead takes a look at the ripple effect throughout the economy. You can see that on the website, and it evaluates it both by the country, by individual states, as well as by congressional districts. And in our experience, that's a great way to talk to members who maybe don't have an emotional connection with anyone involved in the sector, as to what the economic impact is within the geographic area that is of primary interest to them.
All right, and the website is fuelsamerica.org. Well, I just want to, on behalf of the IRFA members and the attendees here, thank you all for being willing to go through blizzards or come up here on very short notice and share with us the thoughts of your expertise. I think you can see that we have some very smart, capable, thoughtful people working for us on these federal policies, and just please join me in giving them a round of applause.